I'm your host, Ebrahim. Welcome to this special program where we're trying to look more in depth at political issues in general. And, the big issue this week has been Israel's, being provided observer status at the African Union. And so to discuss this more in depth and in detail, we're joined by Brother Thembisa Fakude. He's a senior researcher at the Africa-Asia Dialogue, and many of us know him as, previously in Al Jazeera's South Africa Bureau, and also, helping working at Al Jazeera Center for Studies, a more, detailed looking at Middle Eastern politics. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Thembisa, and how are you?
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thanks for joining us today.
Yes.
So, you've been following this quite closely. And the main issue we want to discuss is, if Israel's being granted observer status at the African Union. What does this actually mean? Is it just symbolic? Does it come with any rights, responsibilities? Is there any caveats in terms of its or controls on its balance of power or on its power in the African Union?
Well, I think first of all, this means it's part of the process of normalization of Israel. We know that certain Gulf countries and African countries have gone on to normalize relations with Israel, and accepting Israel or granting Israel a seat at the African Union is also part of the process. It normalizes Israel. That's the first point. The second point is it also brings proximity between Israel and other African countries. And as a result, granting Israel an opportunity to continue to mobilize and lobby African support, which they need at different multilateral platforms where Israel continues to be embarrassed because African countries tend to have this bloc voting pattern. So it will bring the Israel and African countries much more closer, and aiding Israel, therefore, to lobby and make things much more easier for its reputation around the world. But also Israel has started a divide and rule strategy in Africa where it continued not to negotiate with the African Union, but approaching individual countries and coming up with certain financial favors to improve economies, for example, infrastructure development in certain countries. This will give Israel even much more opportunity to continue doing so. And the last point is, whereas in the past Israel has had to use third parties inside the African Union to eavesdrop on what's been happening within the deliberations, what will happen now, Israel will have its own first-hand information, because being the observer grants Israel an opportunity to seek inside the workings and meetings of the African Union, and as a result, it will be able to get first-hand information on what's the agenda, what's going on, and also get the chance to prepare in advance in terms of its own political and socio-economic agenda for Africa and for the African Union.
Okay, now, as you said, it seems to be a lot more in terms of reputation and lobbying abilities, right? There's no, joining the African Union as observers member doesn't necessarily allow you any voting rights, or it just mainly allows you more the ability to lobby, to get first-hand info, and also to try and change the perception of Israel on the continent. The question, though, is, how do African countries, or what is African countries, how are they benefiting from this? Like, why have they, or why has, for example, Chad, basically a majority Muslim country, in the Horn of Africa, why close neighboring Sudan, why are these countries basically supporting this move, normalizing ties with Israel? What's in it for them?
Well, we know at the moment that the narrative, at least from South Africa, is that the decision that was taken by the AU, African Union Commission, was not a consultative decision. In other words, countries are not consulted in this decision, therefore giving the impression that this was a unilateral decision taken by the African Union Commission. Of course, I doubt that. I don't think there's any way that the African Union Commission will make such an important decision without consulting at least the heads of member states. So that's one point. But for African countries, they continue to benefit from Israel, as I've said earlier on, in terms of infrastructural development. We know that Israel has been working closely, for example, with Kenya. They've invited Kenya on a number of occasions. Uhuru Kenyatta has been to Israel to address business in Israel and attract investment into Kenya. The Eastgate Mall, which was attacked by Al-Shabaab some couple of years ago, belongs to Israeli investors. So there's that close working relationship between Kenya and Israel. Uganda also is currently benefiting. Rwanda is the same. Rwanda, we know, is using Pegasus, which is the spyware produced by NSO, the company that's accused of spying against several leaders, including our own Cyril Ramaphosa and Emmanuel Macron. So there is a working relationship between Israel and the African countries, but also Israel is investing on a number of infrastructural development, including boreholes, water purification plants, etc. So it's giving in and it's bringing back some kind of investment. And those countries, they have to reciprocate those gestures by normalizing relations. And one will assume that they lobbied the African Union Commission based on those financial bounties that Israel continues to pour on its African countries for it to obtain or gain that seat and observer seat within the African Union. So there's a lot to gain from the African countries in terms of infrastructural development and other financial benefits.
Okay, you touched on one point there, Rwanda and NSA and Pegasus. We're looking at, the more recent normalizers have been Chad, Sudan, Mali, for example. Countries that, Israeli investment has been more limited, but, Israel's investment has been more in the security sector in terms of counterterrorism, counter-extremism, or what it would call. I wanted to find out what's your take on what does this do for, democratic participation in these states? Because, we're looking at Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda. Kenya, relatively democratic. Rwanda has been using, these softwares to basically spy on most of its population. But, the new trust has seen to not just look at Southern Africa, Anglophone Africa, Christian Africa in a sense, but also at Arab Africa, Muslim Africa, North Africa.
Yeah, so Israel doesn't really care about those, particularly whether it's democracy or not. The attitude is similar to China, it's transactional. It's all dependent on what African countries are willing to provide. And in this case, the priority for Israel is not financial investment from African countries, but votes. Because we know that over the past, Israel is continually experiencing rejection, embarrassment at various multilateral platforms when it comes to voting. It's often the case that there's a block vote from the African Union. And African Union tends, of course, on African countries, because they're weak in terms of their foreign policy, they tend to have this block voting and the block foreign policy positions, because they can't have free standalone foreign positions because of their financial muscles and also because of the political power. So Israel doesn't really need money or investment in return. What it really needs right now is the votes at these multilaterals, and they really don't care about whether there's a proliferation of democracy, freedoms and justices within these African countries, as long as they get what they want.
Okay, and why do you think the sentiment has changed so much? We were looking at in October 2017 the Israel Africa summit that was going to happen in Togo, and that was what the lobbying of South Africa, of Algeria, of also one of the big powers, Nigeria. The summit was then cancelled/suspended. Israel then continued its more bilateral stance. What has changed in the past 3 years, basically 3 years since then, that, we have a decision made by the EU Commission, as you said, likely with consultation. There wasn't any voting. If we're looking at legislation, it doesn't seem as if there's a necessity for voting in terms of observer status. But, what has changed that the EU commissioner, who is very close to the Deby regime in Chad, the dictatorial Deby regime in Chad, a Muslim country, who's actually basically allowed or ratified or proved Israel's observer status?
Well, first of all, I don't think it represents Chad as the chairperson of the African Union Commission. But to answer your question is, the change started during the tenure of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, who came in with transactional politicking. In other words, he was blackmailing the African countries for them to give in and to make certain compromises in return for normalization, and to some extent in countries like Sudan in return for removal of sanctions. So that transactional politics has continued till now. We've seen the demise of the former president of Chad, Idriss Deby, has changed the situation in Chad. You have a new leadership which is more interested in normalizing relations and in building the country. But also, Chad is an extension of Sudan. I mean, Chad, most people will tell you that it's a province of Sudan. Before it used to be a province of Libya while Muammar Gaddafi was around. But now with Sudan strengthening its muscle militarily, Chad is by and large dependent on Sudan. So they will definitely mimic what Sudan does in terms of their foreign policy. Sudan went on to normalize relations with Israel. Chad was expected to do the same. And so that's what you see. So this trend started during the tenure of Donald Trump as the president of the United States, and it continues to be the case. And the reason, as I said, is because in exchange, Israel is coming up with certain development pledges in terms of infrastructure, etc. And also it's facilitating the lobbying of removal of sanctions and normalizing those countries, by the way, most of whom are still regarded as defunct or defunctioning states by the United States, and as a result, impeding the injection of investment in those countries. So it's a continuation of Trump's transactional strategy, transactional politicking, which he initiated, and the Americans are continuing with the same. And Israel took advantage of that situation. And with the election of Joe Biden, that was never rectified. It's still business as usual. And most of those countries started these negotiations and discussions during the tenure of Trump, and these are just a culmination of those discussions.
But as you said, aside from the more controversial points about Sudan and Chad, which we could leave for a different topic in a different day, especially after, Sudan just in 2000 actually tried to overthrow Deby, but we'll talk about that some other time. Trump is gone now. Yes, the transactional politics of Trump is still around, but Trump is no longer there. Biden, yes, he's very close and very pro-Israeli, but he seems to have tried to take a bit of a more balanced approach, trying to reopening up the PLO offices, looking for at means of trying to reestablish funding for the Palestinian Authority, which Trump threatened. So the situation has changed a bit. Is it actually that this has more to do with, as you said before, Israel's lobbying of African countries, and the fact that the African Union as an institute is now, a lot less able to dictate policies, and the policies are dictated by the stronger members, which are now your Kenya, your Ethiopia, your Egypt?
Well, I don't think the U.S. foreign policy towards Israel will ever change, whether it's a Democrat leader or a Republican leader, to remain the same. What has happened with Joe Biden since taking office, he has basically neglected certain decisions that were taken, particularly those that were taken regarding Israel during Trump. We haven't had, for example, any comments from the Biden administration regarding the so-called deal of a century. Yes, they promised that certain things needed to be amended, but it has not been thrown out. It's still on the table. So it's difficult for me to believe that Joe Biden will come up with a different position if he has not even uttered the word of moving towards rectifying or even overhauling the so-called deal of a century, which was drafted by Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. So what I think we see happening in Africa at the moment is a dismantling of this bloc thinking, the bloc politicking of the African Union. You are likely now, with Israel coming into Africa so aggressively, to have freestanding independent foreign policy positions. South Africa is going to come with its own position, Kenya is going to come up with its own position, Ethiopia, etc. Particularly because we don't see much solidarity in Africa when it comes to matters threatening African unity. I mean, Kenya at the moment is fighting its own war regarding Sudan and Egypt when it comes to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The African countries have not come out in defense of Kenya, yes, from the AU perspective or position, they've yet uttered some certain, statements that seek to support the position of Kenya. But we see a lot of solo participation in politics within the African countries. So that is the beginning of, I'd like to believe at least, that is the beginning of a dismantling of this bloc thinking and a bloc foreign policy position of the African Union. And if that had not happened, countries like Israel will have much more better chance of succeeding in pursuing its own foreign policy within the African continent.
The question, though, is: has there ever been really a strong African Union, and has there ever been, real bloc policies in regards to issues that are not necessarily just related to General Assembly and the UN Human Rights Council? I mean, these bilateral relationships have been going on for years, despite the very strong pronouncements of the African Union. So, is it just now Israel being more assertive, or is it actually the fact that these institutions were quite weak initially already? But in saying so, let's go a bit deeper. What does this whole, and the sequencing of these moves seems quite interesting, in a sense that we have, for example, Chad signing on or reestablishing ties in 2019. We have Sudan 2020. We have Mali 2020 as well. But we also at the same time have this division within the Arab bloc. They previously seemed to be a much more stronger consensus on Israel, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we now see the Arab bloc as just Arab states, your Saudi axis, your Qatari axis, your Turkish axis. And how does that then play into these issues that previously may there have been collective action? The big issue with Israel being alienated from the continent was as a result of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. There were 33 countries that had ties with Israel. Prior to then, there were 3 countries or 4 countries that had ties with Israel after that war. So how is this Arab the lack of Arab consensus, in a sense, and the battles within these Arab Gulfdoms and countries actually contributing to Israel, Israel's assertiveness in the region, but also the lack of coalition or consensus building within African countries in opposition to Israeli investment or Israeli incursions or Israeli assistance on the continent.
Yes, I think it has got an impact. Not disunity, but the Arab attitude generally towards Africa has had an impact on what Israel is currently doing, but also it has an impact on how the Africans responded to the gestures presented by Israel. We know the attitude of Arabs has been extremely racist in most instances. They don't see Africans as equal partners, but people who deserve distribution of Quran, the distribution of Qurbani meat. They don't want to engage with Africans as equal partners, except for a few countries like Qatar that has started realizing that it's important to engage with African countries much more seriously. And this is coming back, of course, to haunt the, and disadvantage the people of Palestine, that the past unfortunate actions by the Arab countries towards how they dealt with Africans, now chickens are coming home to roost. Israel has taken that advantage. I mean, how do you expect Africans if the Arab brethren themselves are normalizing relations with Israel? You've got Morocco, you've got Sudan, you've got Bahrain, you've got United Arab Emirates, and soon Saudi Arabia will do the same. How do you expect, therefore, Africans to act in a certain position which is much more stronger than what the Arab brethren are doing? So yes, we can condemn the African Union and condemn our African countries for continuing to act the way they're acting, but the first people that deserve our wrath and condemnation are the Arab countries themselves, including Saudi Arabia, which has sent a number of delegates to go and visit Israel and begin to normalize relations. I mean, Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates is one of the biggest culprits, who has allowed all sorts of things to happen against the people of Gaza, who's gone on to push other countries and put pressure to those countries that are, recipient of the UAE's aid to normalize relations with Israel. So yes, it has got a lot to do with the weakening unity within the Arab countries and the infighting within Arab countries, but also they are setting the Sunnah. They're the ones who are actually normalizing the relations. And Africans now can come and say, don't come and tell us not to normalize relations. Go first and speak to your brethren who are doing the same.
Okay, two more questions before we wrap up. One is, and this may play a role, but may also not play a role, is this fragmentation or this polarity or schism within the Palestinian polity itself. The fact that we have a president who's now in charge, 12 years more than his mandate, the fact that there hasn't been elections for the past 15 years or so, the fact that elections are continuously being postponed. How does this then, this innocent fragmented Palestinian leadership play into both this, the Arabs being able to trample over the Palestinians, but also the fact that Palestine now no longer is seen as, it's moved from the realm of being an ideological issue to something that's become transactional with the Israelis?
Yeah, I think the Palestinian disunity is also very important because it polarizes the message and the political stance that the Palestinians should take to pressure Israel to make certain changes within its politics. So I do agree that that's a problem. And as long as you have two Palestines at the moment, you have Gaza and you've got the West Bank, that in itself also will continue creating problems. You have people in Gaza who see the whole of Palestine from the river to the sea, and we have other people who see Palestine as within the 1967 border. That fundamental political disagreement is likely to create problems as well. So until we have this one unity, one stance on what Palestinians really want, you have Fatah and other small organizations within the band of the Palestinian Liberation Organization having totally different politics compared to what Islamic Jihad and what Hamas, particularly in Gaza, hope for when it comes to Palestine issues of Jerusalem, issues of the right of return, issues of the borders of Palestine. All of those kind of things are espoused and prioritized by at least Islamic Jihad and Hamas, whereas Fatah and other small organizations seem to have taken a different position when it comes to the future status of Palestine.
Okay, and last question before we wrap up, Thembisa. What next? The South Africans has issued a condemnatory statement. The Namibians have condemned the move. The Algerians have condemned the move. But what actually can be done? Can Israel's observer status be reversed? But also, do South Africa and that have the power to do so? South Africa, Algeria, the same countries were very opposed to Morocco being, Morocco's reaccession as a member of the African Union 2 years ago. And Morocco's reaccession went ahead with so much support that they didn't have to vote. It was just a show of hands. So has the balance changed so much that the balance moved away from your Southern Africa, your SADC, your South Africa? South Africa and Algeria are now no longer as relevant as they were previously. Should South Africa rather consider or concentrate more on its own its own unilateral move? We still have an embassy in Israel, despite the fact that for every year we keep hearing that there's going to be moves aimed at degrading and downgrading and closing the embassy, but it's still here. So are we as South Africans, one, is the balance of power changed, but is South Africa also itself speaking with two voices, wanting to have its cake and eat it?
Well, I think what's up next now is you're going to see the dismantling of the positions of Israel in Africa. It's already started. All the East African countries. In Sudan, one of the main Muslim countries, and where there is a strong Palestinian solidarity movement, that decided to normalize the relations, and countries like Morocco and Rwanda and Kenya normalize the relations, Uganda, in terms of trade, then you are likely to see certain countries being isolated, and they might eventually feel pressure to normalize the relations with Israel. I'm, for example, skeptical with regards to the statement that has been issued by DERCO, that the heads of state were not elected, including the past immediate chairperson of the African Union, who is Cyril Ramaphosa. I don't believe that. I think just people are pulling wool over our eyes. There certainly was some sort of discussion. You don't normalize relations. These discussions are likely have started during the tenure of our president as the chairperson of the African Union. There is absolutely no way that you're going to have a 2 weeks, 3 months discussion in this regard, and the results are culminating in the situation that we're currently seeing. These discussions have started quite some time ago. We know that Israel has always been trying to lobby to be an observer member. People like Muammar Gaddafi were the ones who were vehemently against that move. And for DERCO to be telling us that they did not know, I don't know, I find it very hard to believe. They might be telling the truth, but I find it extremely hard to believe. That's the first point. But the only way we can put pressure on Israel, of course, is to continue supporting the actions of the BDS campaign, to continue calling for withdrawal of the embassy and the expulsion of the ambassador of Israel from South Africa, and to continue with all those efforts that are currently taking place, which is the attempts that BDS continues to, attempts that BDS are currently engaged in doing.
Okay. Shukran so much, Thembisa, for this engaging discussion. We'll take it up sometime next in the next program, talking maybe about other issues more closer, as the current coup in Tunisia, for example, which also seems to play into this whole dominance or this narrative of Israel has a big role in terms of UAE and Saudi support for the coup, and the repression of Nahda, which is the one, in a sense, pro-Palestinian voice in Tunisia itself.
Inshallah.
And I hope everyone who's listened enjoyed the program. Feedback will be gladly accepted, and in future we'll try to announce the program a bit earlier to try and get questions that you guys think may be important to ask. Shukran jazilan. Wa billahi wa tawfiq. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam.
Listen to something fresh. Listen to